Portugal in the 1970s had experienced nearly 50 years of authoritarian rule since the 1926 May 28th revolution. The state's regime was named the Estado Novo, or New State, and had very few legitimate elections, as opposition parties were heavily repressed. Portugal's Estado Novo government remained neutral during the Second World War and was initially tolerated by NATO and its post-war partners due to its anti-communist stance. But as the Cold War developed, Western Bloc and Eastern Bloc states vied with each other for supporting guerrillas in Portuguese colonies, leading to the 1961 to 1974 Portuguese colonial wars in Angola, Mozambique, and Guinea-Bissau. The Portuguese economy encouraged the formation of large conglomerates. The regime maintained a policy of corporatism, which resulted in the placement of much of the economy in the hands of conglomerates and their founding families, which held great political influence. Many of these conglomerates owned a diverse production of essential resources and were headquartered across the Portuguese Empire, and therefore had major interests in the results of the Portuguese colonial wars. Portugal also faced these three major colonial wars since 1961, and by the early 1970s the Portuguese military was overstretched and there was no political solution in sight. Although the number of casualties for the Portuguese was relatively small, the war had entered its second decade. Portugal faced massive criticism from the international community and was becoming increasingly isolated. Additionally, there were some tensions between the Portuguese military and Portuguese militia groups which went to Africa and wanted to be commissioned officers without earning their ranks or even being part of the military, which the government had allowed. Planning for the military coup against the government began in February of 1974 after Prime Minister Marcelo Caetano decided to remove General Antonio de Spinola from the command of the Portuguese forces in Guinea-Bissau, in the face of Spinola's increasing disagreement over the promotion of militiamen to officers and the direction of the Portuguese colonial policies, as well as the conflicts. This occurred shortly after the publication of Spinola's book titled Portugal and the Future, which he expressed his political and military views on the Portuguese colonial wars. Several military officers who opposed the wars formed the Armed Forces Movement, or MFA, to overthrow the authoritarian government. The MFA was headed by decorated and experienced Portuguese officers being Vitor Alves, Otelo Saraiva de Carvalho, and Vasco Lourenço, and it was later joined by Salgueiro Maia, and the movement was aided by other Portuguese army officers who supported Spinola and the democratic, civil, and military reforms. The revolution began with local disc jockeys playing certain music which the MFA officers had agreed to alert them into starting the coup on April 25, 1974. A central gathering point was the Lisbon flower market, then richly stocked with carnations. Some rebels put carnations in their gun barrels as an image that was broadcast around the world through television, which gave the revolution its name. Although no mass demonstrations preceded the coup, spontaneous civilian involvement turned the military coup into a popular revolution. Prime Minister Caetano then hid in the Lisbon military police headquarters. He was then surrounded by the MFA, which pressured him to cede power over to General Spinola. Caetano then fled to Brazil like a wuss. 4 civilians were shot dead by government forces under the Directorate General Security, whose personnel involved were later arrested by the MFA for their murders. After the coup, power was held by the National Salvation Junta, which was a military junta to maintain Portuguese stability. Portugal then experienced a turbulent period known as the ongoing revolutionary process, where many different political factions vied for power. Although Spinola had advocated for political groups to avoid radicalization after the revolution, there would be several coup attempts and counter-coups during Portugal's transition to democracy by pretty much all sides of the political spectrum. Presidential elections would then be held in Portugal on the 27th of June 1976, and with a broad base of support that comprised of the center-left and the center-right, decorated General Antonio Ramalho Inês won the election as an independent candidate, became the first elected president of Portugal after the Carnation Revolution. Decolonization occurred in 1974 with the end of the Portuguese colonial wars, and the African countries won their wars of independence. Mozambique and Angola then each entered a period of long and drawn-out civil war between different factions after the Portuguese withdrawal, which then was also influenced by Cold War politics. Additionally, East Timor was a Portuguese protectorate before the Carnation Revolution, and afterwards the Portuguese left and the Indonesians invaded the country in 1975. Portuguese Freedom Day of April 25th is a national holiday, with state-sponsored and spontaneous commemorations of the civil liberties and political freedoms that were achieved after the Carnation Revolution. It commemorates the 25th of April 1974 revolution and Portugal's first free elections on the date the following year. Additionally, there are many monuments to the officers who led the Carnation Revolution. Did you know about the Carnation Revolution before this video? Are there any elements that I left out or should have talked more about? Let me know in the comments, and thank you for watching.